What I wanted to say is we've been so blessed by the conversation here as well, and it's as enriching for us. So thank you for that, and just for our atmosphere to just so honestly share what we enjoy. On Thursday night, most of you were there, but we kind of ended off on a theme that we can explore so much further, and that's the thought of not only our experience of God, but God's experience of us. And I wanted to take that thought a little bit further, and then we're just going to throw it up to conversation, kind of just as a catalyst. So we're very open for just a conversational engagement. So our experience of God and God's experience of us. Now I'm going to use a few contrasting ideas for what I want to present, and I use these contrasts because they often help things to be clearer. So maybe you find, as I present you with contrasting ideas, maybe you find, oh, I had the opposite idea. That was my idea always. So this is an alternative way of seeing it. Or you might say, no, I always thought this way. But I think still having a contrast helps us see what we mean even better. And so when we speak of God's experience of us, probably the most difficult thing within the theological world to speak about God's experience is this idea that God is absolutely changeless. So if God is absolutely changeless, we've developed those philosophical ideas mainly because the first theologians engaged with Plato, and Plato kind of suggested this idea that if something's perfect, it must be changeless. And any change in perfection, any change will make it less than perfection. So for Plato, perfection was the ultimate state, and if you diverged from it in any way, it's less than perfect. So the early theologians, wanting to speak to their community in a language that they understood, adopted some of the philosophical categories of understanding of their day to speak to their world. And so for them, God was perfect. So obviously God is changeless. Philosophy and just about every other science has developed since Plato. Today, there are few philosophers and less and less theologians that believes perfection speaks of an ultimate state. Most of them now think that perfection is more like a number. If you can think of the highest number, you can always add one, and it's bigger. Or perfection, maybe it's something like beauty. You can see a beautiful sunset that is just perfect, but it is constantly changing. There's change within that perfect. And tomorrow there's a sunrise that's also beautiful and also just perfect for what it is, but it doesn't capture all that beauty is. So the ideas of perfection and changelessness has developed, and maybe let me show you how it then was incorporated in our theology and how it might have affected us without us even knowing. Thomas Aquinas was the first theologian who basically developed this idea of God's changelessness to the extent that he would say even God's knowledge is changeless. So God knows the future as clearly as he knows the present and the past. Have you been exposed to that idea? Okay, most of us have. And so, excuse me?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So, when they asked Thomas Aquinas, how does God know the future? His answer was simply because God saw it as clearly as he sees you. Now, the reason he could say that is because his idea of God was kind of like a Doctor Strange. Somebody that can move outside of time or manipulate time. It's kind of the idea, if you imagine this table being time, his idea of God is a being that could move outside of time and look at the whole table from beginning to end. So here we are. So that's you. Sorry, Zoom friends, I'm just going to do a little illustration. But if you imagine a box of time and you put a person here in the middle, this is the past, that is the future. The idea was we moving through time, and so everything's new for us. But if God is able to be outside of time, he sees the future as clearly as the past. Now, let's bring that idea into the 21st century. So what's currently the thinking around time? Or maybe let's think about the theological implications first, and then I'll bring it into the alternative. The theological implications of a God who can stand outside of time is exactly what Thomas Aquinas purposed it to be, and that is God's knowledge is changeless. Can you see how that makes sense? So for a God who is outside of time, nothing new happens because he's already seen it. Now, if you go and search for an alternative word for the concept of nothing new happens, it's the word boring. A God for whom nothing new happens, who's absolutely changeless, even in his own knowledge, is not just boring from our perspective. He's absolutely bored within himself. Because genuinely nothing new happens. And you might go through some great ecstasy or through some deep, deep pain. It means nothing new to that God. Because he's seen it from the beginning. And he kind of patronizes us and makes us feel as if he feels with us. But he's always felt it all and knew it all. Okay, so there's the theological implications of a God who stands outside of time gives us a sense of security, because even though we don't have a clue what's going to happen, at least God does. So that's a great positive. But we don't often think of the negative, and that is that God is he's the omni-boring God. You can't get more boring than that nothing new ever happens. So here's an alternative view. And remember, the reason I want to share this is to bring it back to what does it mean to the way God experiences you. So here's the alternative view. And if you want some great scientific, philosophical and current thinking on this, there's a book by Carlo Ravelli called The Order of Time. So let's think about time quickly. Now, if we look at the watch and see all the hours, what does it measure? It measures movement. It measures change. 24 hours is how long it takes our Earth to spin on its axis. A year is how long it takes our Earth to spin around our sun. Those measurements that we call time are measurements of movement. Movement is real. Time is an abstract concept that we took from what is real to kind of explain that. Now, the latest thinking, because since Einstein kind of said, what, space and time is really inseparable. And what he was trying to say is, again, that we are currently in a certain relationship to one another in space, and any change is an opportunity to measure something. And that measurement of change coming closer or further from you, that's time. And so Einstein went to the extent to say, actually your head and your toes have different times because they've got a different relationship to gravity. Your head's a little bit further away from the earth. And then he also said, actually speed is another relationship that changes how we relate to things. And this book by Carlo Rovelli is beautiful to bring us to a very simple conclusion, and that is every point in reality has got its own time. Why? Because it's got its own set of relationships. And ultimately, time is nothing but a measure of change. How does my relationships change? This is where I can measure time. So, this is an alternative view from time. This basically says that the past relationships happened. The future relationships has not happened yet. So it genuinely does not exist. There's no, the only way in this understanding of time for God to be outside of time would be for God to be outside any relationship. Can you imagine a God without any relationship? And when I speak of relationship, I mean even his knowledge of what's happening, because knowledge is a relationship. I don't think such a God exists. I think the God revealed in Jesus is a God who is absolutely part of the relational mesh that makes up our cosmos. Mesh or mess, whatever you want to call it. This relational world that we're in, God is part of it. And for God, the future is as open as it is for us. In other words, the future has not happened yet. And if it hasn't happened yet, it is possible, not actual. So God knows what is possible, and he probably knows it more clearly than our individual perspectives. But he's not certain.
So you're saying he doesn't actually know what was going to happen?
Yes.
Yeah.
And before...
So how many people love that thought? And how many people freak out before? Like, if you know what's coming, then why do I have to pray for it?
Yes.
Other things to do.
Exactly.
Like, it's already done, so why would I ever pray for something
Yes.
futuristic?
Yes.
If
Exactly. Exactly.
You're just trying to waste my time. Christianity is just a big time waste.
Yeah.
Totally. It's already done.
Yeah.
You're in charge of it all. What
Mm-hmm.
am I supposed to do about it?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
it seems like we have to excuse all the Calvinists out of the room. I so take it for granted that time is something that you can be outside of, that now I have to like break all of my
Yeah.
structures I built on top of that.
Yeah.
If I'm going to consider an alternative.
Yes. so the Carlo the Carlo Rovelli book is brilliant. I think he won some amazing awards for his work in quantum physics and all of those things.
And if you listen to it on Audible, Benedict Cumberbatch.
Can you give us this
So-
stuff?
Say.
My phone's engaged otherwise.
So the book is called The Order of Time, and the author is Carlo, C-A-R-L-O, Rovelli, R-O-V-E-L-L-I. I don't think so. I think it's Carlo. Yeah. And he's got some good YouTube videos as well. So that will kind of help you kind of deal with that side of it. So I'm going to kind of delve into the theological side. So whether you agree with that, just put it on the back burner and kind of think of what are the implications and the possibilities. So one of the possibilities of this new way of thinking is that the future is not determined, but open. That possibilities are real. In other words, there's things that are not certain either for us or for God. You cannot reduce possibility to certainty. If something's certain, it's not possible. If it's possible, it's not certain. So if the future is truly open and truly possible, then when Jesus introduces us to his Father and he says to God, all things are possible, that is a very different introduction than what we mainly get in our traditional churches, which is, to this God, all things are certain. Jesus doesn't introduce us to the God for whom all things are certain, but rather to the God for whom all things are possible. Now this, yes.
Does this also relate to, I'm thinking about, you're so, connected also with desire, when he's talking about the substance of faith being things hoped for, that also speaks to possibility.
Yes.
Meaning that our relational connection with him is about possibility and desire and mutual connection. Is that
Absolutely. Now, if God wants to get the beauty, the goodness, the truth that he wants, he needs our cooperation to get this. This makes your creativity so significant. This makes your life so irreplaceable and valuable, because you are the one that's going to actualize the possibilities in the mind of God. You are the body through which God can achieve the beauty that he envisions is possible for this universe. And so how does that change God's experience of our world, of you? Well, one thing that I really appreciate is that such a God is not patronizing. He doesn't make as if he cares, but really he's already seen it all. He doesn't give us the illusion that he feels with us, but actually is absolutely changeless. This God is truly in relationship. In other words, he feels with us. Your joy is his joy. Your suffering is his suffering. Your freedom is his freedom. That this world is where the possibilities in the mind of God becomes actual. And without us, God would be imprisoned in a mental fantasy. I'm finding new words to try and describe what I'm seeing. And what I'm seeing is, for God, you are of incredible value. Because you make his dreams come true. You make his imagination actual.
So it would make our life with him a true adventure, not just for us, but for him as well.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
he sees the possibilities, but he's not actually
Yes.
knows all the things.
Yeah.
It's a true co-adventure.
Yes. Yes. And that kind of, obviously brings up the thought of, but doesn't God know all things? His omniscience. And
Know that.
and his omniscience, I can still completely say yes, first and foremost, in that he knows everything that can be known. And what can be known is everything that's happened and everything that is currently experienced by every molecule in this universe. God is present and God knows it. So for me, the idea of God's omnipresence and omniscience become merged. It's because God is present everywhere that he knows everything that can be known. And again, I would say, of course, he's, because of that width and breadth and depth of his knowledge, he can foresee the future and what is the most likely possibilities to realize more clearly than we can individually. Yet he also knows that some things are possible and not certain. And so for me, God's omniscience is God knows everything that can be known, including the fact that some things are indeterminate.
I'm just watching you.
So you were talking about this on Thursday, and my brain blew up, like all of the safety and all of these things. So I've been like the last 2 days, I've been trying to like unravel all the theology behind it and like prophetic words and stuff like that. I think someone got it on Thursday. So I just feel like the Lord's like, and this is how people can get prophetic words, because they are seeing the possibilities.
Yes, yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Love it. And
again,
yes.
I was going to, again, as you say that, and even, it gives God the opportunity to respond in a sense, like a human, which being Jesus, is a way to have that actual conversation, that something that he can get joy out of how we're co-creating. I'm trying to think of how, not knowing specifically what we're going to do, but just being delighted at how we're thinking or what it is that's going on. That's a great way of looking at God, and the way that I sense him responding to me. Like when I'm talking to him and asking him things and I hear him laughing. I mean, that's a response that is of him just being right there with me in that moment. And so,
love it.
And responding to everything that it is, and for me, just that anticipation. Okay, he's there, not that he knows what's going on. That's a different thought, but that he is responding to how I'm responding to even information he's giving me, and whatever it is that I'm seeing, and knowledge that I know, kind of even about the Bible or about him from past experiences. So yeah.
Love it, Linda. That's so beautiful. It makes it makes relationships so much more real. And
Yeah.
so now if we start thinking of in what ways do God change and in what ways does he stay the same? So rather than asking, is God changeless or does God change? Because I can give you scriptures out of the Bible that says God is changeless, and I can give you many scriptures out of the Bible that says God changes. So I think a more healthy way of asking the question is, in which ways do God change, and in which ways does God stay the same? So before we started formalizing all these doctrines and get our orthodoxy, before Thomas Aquinas and all of them, the people who wrote the scriptures, I mean, what was quite radical about it is a God who enters into these covenant relationships. And the covenant relationship was, hey, if you do this, I do this. And if I do this, you do that. It was kind of a relational movement that wasn't guaranteed. It kind of, in a way, said, what God does is sometimes dependent on what you do. And what you are capable of doing is also dependent on God's commitment to you to make it possible. So it was much more relational. I'll just put that back so that I can sit in the front of the seat. So in what ways, let's start off, in what ways does God change? I can say that if God participates in our experience from moment to moment, then every new experience to us is a new experience to God. So even us sitting here together now, we might not think there's much creativity or much novelty about this moment. We've all sat in conversations before. So there's something familiar about it, but there's also something novel. This particular group of people sitting together discussing these specific ideas, it has never happened in the history of our universe. Okay, there's something, however small the novelty is, there's something novel about this moment and about this experience that is novel and new to God as well then. So for me, that blows my mind, that our lives to some extent enriches God. That our experience contributes to the experience of God.
How could we not have been thinking this all this time?
Yeah.
Like, seriously, duh.
And that, you know, even things like thoughts, remember, if we go back to time is just a measure of change, a thought is a movement. There's a feeling is a movement. So to imagine an absolutely changeless God is to imagine a thoughtless, feelingless God. So we've dealt with that. We think God changes in significant ways. He experiences things, he thinks things, he feels things. God is truly in relationship with us. But how do we, and there's many scriptures where God changed his mind, where God thought one thing's going to happen and then something else happens. Where the nation of Israel does something and he says, whoever gave you that idea, it has never occurred to me. So there's a scripture in the Bible where God says, that never occurred to me. But it occurred to people. Oh, that's an interesting one, Angela. That's an interesting one. The event, an evil event that happened, where Israel sacrificed their children. And God says, who gave you that idea? It never occurred to me. you can see that that possibility for evil is not in the mind of God, never occurred to him, but it occurred in the minds of people who misinterpreted God themselves and others and came to that conclusion. So there's many significant ways in which God changed. Now, in what way can we say God does not change? Again, for the early Hebrew thinkers, they weren't really too invested in the Greek philosophical ideas of time. So for them, changelessness wasn't mingled up with Greek philosophy. For them, God's changelessness was simply his faithfulness. That God remains reliable. He's always love. He's always good. He's always reliable in that sense. And so what's a good picture? We have friends who live near a waterfall on their farm, and this waterfall is constant because it's behind this massive range of mountains. And even when there's a drought in the whole of South Africa, this waterfall keeps on being faithful. And in that sense, I can say it is changeless. But when you go closer to the waterfall, you also realize it is constantly changing. And so in that sense, we can say that God's changelessness is the consistency of his change. You know, that God is consistently responding to us. God is consistently doing his best for us. God is consistently opening up possibilities for beauty and for good.